Okay, hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about myth, and we will focus on flood myths for this particular lecture. This will probably run for two class sessions for the live class, and therefore it will be two recordings. So if you are in the online class, this is going to be part one, and part two will be coming on Thursday. This is now Tuesday, September 5th, 2023. So we have a class who I cannot see, but can see this in the classroom. And then we have about 20 or so, a little over 20 people here on Zoom. And so if there are questions from the class, maybe Sarah can funnel those for me as we go along, and I'll try to look at chat as we go along. So the question is about people on Zoom with cameras turned on and off. I'm not going to be too concerned about that today. I always prefer cameras on, and like if it's an office hours thing, then yes, but I'm not going to worry about it particularly today. Okay, so the topic of myth is one that is fascinating to me, and we have some interesting perspectives in our textbook, including the myth of the hero's journey, which we'll find in many modern films. And so that brings up one point. When we think about myth, we're not just talking about something from the ancient past. We're not just talking about your myths of the Greeks with Zeus and so forth. But yes, those are included. And actually, Zeus will show up in one of the myths we're talking about. We're not just talking about Thor going back to ancient times. We're also talking about myth as it appears throughout history, and myth is always in whatever form is current in its given time. So what are the ways that myth are transmitted today? Well, mainly through books, and especially through film. So you'll find a lot of film that are part of what we conceive of as myth. And now, how do we conceive of myth? So that's our next slide here. So I have here 4 features of myth, and kind of a sub-feature of the last one. So myths are first and foremost stories. Now, religions and cultures give us all kinds of ways of getting lessons about life and so forth. But the most powerful, the most compelling are to tell it in story form. And so we could think of ancient times or prehistoric times sitting around the campfire with the elders telling the stories of the past. And some of those are mythological and some are not. But if we're talking about myth stories, these are stories that are sacred. These are stories that are a little special. They have a place, a special place in the culture. And they are powerful stories as well. So now I move on to our second bullet point here. So we're not talking about any stories, we're talking about those stories that are powerful. And we mean powerful in an emotional sense. We mean powerful in an intellectual sense. So these are stories that create some kind of emotional weight in us at the same time as they evoke our brains, our imagination, our intellect, in the questions that they raise, and in the sometimes very dramatic events that happen. And really, one way we can look at power in terms of myth as we take these two terms, their emotional impact, their intellectual effect, and it's not just each of these separately, it's how these two work together. That is, we get to some very powerful scene that has an emotional impact on us. And that leads us to think about it. Why was I so impacted by this? And then the opposite. We get to a part of a myth that raises these deep questions about our existence. And that might bring emotions up in us, emotions of awe or wonder, for example, or maybe even fear. So power means that emotion, intellect, they're working together, they're mutually reinforcing. So you know when you have a myth, these two levels are going on. So our third feature of myth is that these are stories that have lasted, they've withstood the test of time. Some are some of the oldest stories ever told, at least the oldest story ever written down. And you'll see one of my examples will be the oldest, as far as I know anyway, the oldest written story is included here, and that will be the story of Gilgamesh. So myths, because of their power, because of their resonance, they don't just come up and disappear into into all the stories that come up in any given culture. They're stories that have lasted, they have spread far and wide. Perhaps they start in one culture, but they're so powerful, they're so evocative, they speak to us, so they spread from culture to culture. Not always in exactly the same form, but sometimes we can see the kernels that show that one story from one part of the world might show up in another story in another part of the world. And that stories that exist today, for example, you go to the theater and you watch, the latest Marvel universe, multiverse film, and it happens to feature the god Thor and Loki and so forth. Well, these are stories that go back to the, over 1,000 years originally. And the fact that they're still being told today kind of shows that these stories have lasting power. Now, why are they lasting? What gives them power? Well, now we come to our fourth feature. These are stories that address some of the key things that humans are concerned with, the truths of the human condition. Where did we come from? What is our origin? What is the nature of good and evil? What makes a person good? What is a good life? And our morality, in other words, and what's going to happen to us? What is the destiny? What is our destiny as individuals? What is the destiny of humanity? And so all of these truths exist in what we call the deep structure of the myth. You have a story, it's just proceeding like any story. You have good things happening to people, bad things happening to people, dramatic incidents coming up, and so forth. But underneath these are these very deep questions that are being asked in the deep structure. And then finally, we also mention that myths may have some elements that are true. They may have some elements that are fictional, but that's not what is important. The important thing is the truths in terms of the truths about the human condition, not whether, for example, a flood actually happened. Oftentimes, these types of details are hard to verify. Other times, they're points of contention. But really, they're not the most important things. Again, it's the power of myths and what these myths say about us as humans, say about the deities that we hold dear, say about the world that we live in. And so we'll see this. play out in the slides that follow. So I'm going to pause just a second to see if there are any questions from the audience. I'm looking at chat. Okay, so I will pause again after the next slide. So we're going to be talking about flood myths. So we want to take a moment to look at the issue of natural disasters. I have used here in a few other slides some images from Hurricane Katrina long ago, as people are waiting in this particular image. They're waiting for rescue, and they're telling people who are looking that the water is rising. One of the things that humans have to deal with is, an environment that might be changing, an environment that is not necessarily always predictable. Even in these days of meteorology, where we can make models of the weather, we can't always predict the weather. And especially weather that is extreme can have this dramatic impact on us and our livelihood and our civilizations. But we don't always have a good idea of being able to predict what is going to happen to us. So nature, let's say in the modern secular world, we just say, nature is taking its course. But in a religious context, this has to do perhaps with the will of the deities. So either way. So we have myths across the world in many cultures that have to do with natural disasters. Myths about earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, drought, fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, and of course floods are common elements in myth, often to express the will of the supernatural. That the supernatural, whether it's a principle, just karma, or whether it's a deity such as the Judeo-Christian god Yahweh, brings disaster as a way to give a message to humanity, or to have a certain outcome in terms of humanity. One of the most common themes, and now I'm in the last bullet here, is that we are out of balance. That is why a disaster is coming. That we are supposed to be maintaining balance and harmony between ourselves as humans, nature, and the supernatural. So these three things, you might see it as the three-legged stool of balance that we'll find in myth. In other words, myths have something to do with us as humans. That's a very common feature, or maybe sometimes creatures that stand in for humans, as we'll see in the Native American myth, where we have talking animals. Myths are talking about some event that happens in nature, and myths often attribute what's going on to the supernatural. Our next slide. I'll pause to see if there are any questions for a moment. So you see there's a McDonald's sign there. This is again in New Orleans around the time of Katrina. It's being, here, this is my own symbolism of showing our modern civilization and, in my opinion, bad food choices leading to disaster. I'm kind of joking, kind of not. So we come to the question, how about flood myths? Why amongst all the natural disasters do we have flood myths? And why is it that flood myths are the most common type of natural disaster myths? So if one did an inventory of myths around the world, and we can, if you're taking one of my classes, there's a database in the library called the Electronic Human Relations Area Files. And that has information on hundreds, maybe thousands of different cultures. And so we can take an inventory of myth, and other scholars have, and we found out that flood myths are the most common. So we can ask that question, why is it flood myths? Why not myths about hurricanes or fires, and so forth? Well, we'll try to answer that question as best we can in this slideshow. So myths are the most common. Myths appear, myths of floods appear in cultures all around the world. And interestingly enough, we have flood myths even in areas that are not prone to flooding. So I'm going to click on this link. As I was telling the class before I started the recording, it appears some of my links have gone, are no longer valid. I believe this one is still good though. All right, so this takes us to the site called Flood Stories from Around the World by Mark Isaac. Let me pause for a moment and mention essay 1. So in essay 1, one of the options is to write about flood myths. This is the site that you'll be going to and choosing your 2 myths. Make sure when you reference this that you put the author as Mark Isaac. Title is Flood Stories Around the World. And I'll show you why I say this when I get to an example. All right, so if I scroll down the page, we see this index by region. So we have Europe, and then you have Greeks and Romans, etc. The Near East, the Sumerians, Egyptians, etc. Africa, Cameroon, the Maasai, Asia, many in Asia, including, for example, the flooding in the Yangtze River in China. Australia has them, Pacific Islands in North America, Central America, South America. So these are all flood myths. So let me click on one. I'm going to pull up the Tarascan. This is randomly. I'm not looking to go over this myth. I just want to show you what we have here. And so this is actually a longer one. And you see this is coming from Orcasitas. That's the reference. And so the message here is when you're referencing this in your paper, don't reference it by this person. This is just a reference within this website. Always reference it by Mark Isaac. Okay, so enough about essay 1. If I scroll down, you see some of these myths are fairly small, like the one from Michoacan is only 2.5 lines long. Some are longer. All right, so that's this site. Let me come back to our slideshow. And so if you wanted to do an analysis of those cultures, we find out that the cultures that are most likely to have flood myths are agricultural societies. And all major ancient agricultural societies had flood myths. They were very important. And the question is not too opaque as to why, and the answer to it as to why this is the case, that these are civilizations that relied on irrigation agriculture. So too much water would be a disaster, as well as too little water would be a disaster. So you'll find these flood myths in major civilizations and minor ones all over the world. But where you have agriculture, you definitely will have these myths. Okay, so that gives us a little bit of a way forward. Now we're going to start looking at some more particular cases. And first, we come up to this question, a question that has been asked for a couple of thousand years. Was there a universal flood? Well, in the 21st century, the science of geology is a mature science. We do have an answer to this question, and that answer is, if we're talking about the period in which humans have been on the planet, if we're talking about the period in which life in general has existed on planet Earth, the answer is no. In Earth's early history, billions of years ago, all of the Earth was covered with water at one point, but that's not relevant to our question here, because we're talking about in the myths, about humans. And there has not been a universal flood since humans have been on the planet, or even when any life has been on the planet. There's always been some land sticking up somewhere. So that goes against the claims of some myths, including one of the more key myths in Western civilization, the story of Noah, that talked about a universal flood, but we'll get to that. So we do have evidence of a big flood that may have given rise to the idea that there was a universal flood. So 7,500 years ago, in the Black Sea, if I scroll down a little bit, here's a map. The blue areas are water, the yellow areas land. And right here where I'm moving the cursor is the Black Sea. South of the Black Sea is Turkey. To the west is Greece. To the north is the Ukraine. Sticking out here is Crimea, which is being fought over right now. If we were looking for some of the earlier myths, we'd find them in this area in ancient Palestine, and in the area over here, that's with Mesopotamia. And as we'll see, we'll find myths over here in Greece as well. So about 7,500 years ago, what happened? Well, two geologists from Columbia University studied this. They went out in a boat onto the Black Sea. They took soundings, they did their due diligence as scientists. And what they discovered was that the coastline had been in about a mile in some places, and there are signs of towns and villages that are covered underwater. So there had been thriving communities at one point 7,500 years ago, and then a massive event happened that covered these places in water. Now, what was this? Well, there was a global warming event during that time, kind of like we're experiencing now, and except at that time it was a natural global warming. Our current global warming is largely human influenced. So what happened was that seas were were rising due to melting ice sheets at the poles. The Atlantic Ocean out here was rising. The Atlantic flowed over the Strait of Gibraltar right here between Spain and Morocco. It's a little strait. Water came into the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, the Aegean seas, rising as it was going. This was not sudden. It took years for this to happen. And then eventually over here, you have what's called the Bosphorus Straits. And this is where I believe where Istanbul is. And, and then flowing into the Black Sea. So the geologists created a scenario. They thought of a person who lived on this coast and their family, and they see that the land that they depend on is being flooded, and so they're going to move inland. So all around them, it seems that there's flood everywhere initially. Seems like the whole world has been flooded, meaning not literally planet Earth, but their world. So I think if we take a little bit of a slight interpretation and change the whole world to the world of the people affected by the flood, it seems like it's all encompassing. So basically what we have is a story of survival of a person who gathers their family, gathers all their animals, puts them on a boat, and then seeks land, probably moving, more inland. And then eventually they find land in a dry place near a mountain. Okay. So in other words, this is not a miraculous story in the telling of these geologists, but just a pretty compelling story of survival. So this happens around 7,500 years ago. Now, it's not until 5,000 years ago or so that we start to get instances of writing. So there's no written record, until the 3000s, the 2000s BC. And so in other words, from 7,500 until the invention of writing, this was a story that went word of mouth. It went from place to place, and it was a great story of survival. Whoever was, first came up with the story made it really compelling. And so it went in terms of the ancient world, that went viral, okay, and spread all over the place. But as oral stories do, and I think many of you have played the game of telephone, that's where you sit in a circle, somebody whispers something to the person next to them, and the whisper goes around the circle, and you see how the message has changed on the other end. So similar to that, place to place, this story goes, and it changes as it goes along. Sometimes it changes because people hear different things. Sometimes it's changing because people, as they bring the story into their culture, kind of want to make it more relevant to the way they think of the world. Okay. So you have the story just really taken off, going all over the place, changing in form here and there. So that is our working hypothesis. Not a universal flood, just a really big flood in this area that affected life for many people. Actually, you can go also to the edge of this map over into India, because there's some vestiges of the same story. It was called the story of Manu. And Manu is a avatar of the god Vishnu, who turns into a fish and experiences the flood that way. So all the way to India and other places the story went. Okay, so again, this is our working hypothesis for at least the stories we find in this part of the world. So we're going to start in this part of the world, a little bit to the south. So I just found this site. I see the link. I need to redo this slide because it's not really linked. At the moment, you can you know, grab it and put it into a bar and pull it up. If I don't get to put in the Insta link too soon. So anyway, what you'll find here is a comparison of the Noah story in Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. So the Epic of Gilgamesh was one of the first stories, or not just one of the first stories, unless things have changed, the oldest written story from the Sumerian civilization about 5,000 years ago. Don't quote me on dates. I'm pretty bad at dates, but around that time. And we see a lot of similarities between the two stories. And so let me just outline a few of them. So in both stories, you have a situation where humans are deficient. Humans are noisy, or humans are bad, or humans are wicked. And so for God, or one of the gods, because in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have a polytheistic pantheon of gods. So you have some of the gods who are angry at humans and others that aren't. But in the Genesis story, you have one God, and that God has both reactions: anger at humans, but the desire to save one of them. Okay, so in the Gilgamesh story, you have some of the gods who are angry and other gods that are on the side of humans that go and warn humanity. In that case, it's a man named Utnapishtim. In the case of Genesis, it's Noah. So in both cases, they are instructed to build an ark and put on all the animals. So this happens, and then the flood comes, the rains come. It rains for how long? Can anybody in the audience here tell me, put in chat, how long does it rain in the Noah story? "40 days and 40 nights. One reason I asked that, isn't that interesting how it is phrased? We could say 40 days, and we wouldn't come to the conclusion that at night it stopped raining. We would just assume that day meant, the full 24 hours. But it's expressed in the book of Genesis in that way: 40 days and 40 nights. Now, in the Gilgamesh story, it's a little different. I think it's 7 days and 7 nights, but it's said that same way: days and nights. So some scholars of myth think this is one indication of the original oral story. When you have oral stories, they have these phraseology in it that help people remember. And sometimes it's said in a certain way in order to make it more kind of a poetic meter. So the idea that in both stories that are written, it takes on this form that we see in oral stories, shows that before they were written, they were told by word of mouth. Okay. So that's the point I wanted to make there. but onward with the story. So it's raining for this long period of time. The whole world, as far as the people can tell, is covered. And then eventually birds are sent out to find land. 3 birds. In both stories, you have 3 birds. In the Noah story, it's a dove that finds land. The story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's a raven. So you have in one a white bird and another a black bird. And this tells us another thing about myth, another common element. As myths go from place to place, culture to culture, sometimes these elements are changed on purpose so that the receiving culture can kind of make the myth their own, put their own stamp on it. In this case, ravens are very important in Middle Eastern culture, as are doves. So you have animals that are very kind of symbolically important, but differentiated by their color, definitely, to say, well, we're no longer this myth, now we're that myth. We're our own myth, or we're telling our own myth. Okay. So we have here, second bullet point, this term diffusion. Diffusion simply means that that elements of culture move from one culture to another. In this case, the Israelite and Babylonian culture. Aha, it says Babylonian here, but I said Sumerian before. So the Babylonians are a later culture that inherited the a lot of the territory and a lot of the cultural features of the Sumerians, who were there a few thousand years before them. They also inherited the myth of Gilgamesh. So we have Babylonian tablets with Gilgamesh on the same story on it. On the Israelite side, we have the historical case of the Israelites, or at least some of the tribes of Israel, being captive and sent to Babylon to live there. And during this time, and we see this in some of the prophets, Ezekiel and so forth, complaining that the Israelites are taking up the culture of the Babylonians, which they're kind of seeing as sinful. Well, what was probably happening is that the Israelites were assimilating. They were assimilating into Babylonian culture. They were picking up food and music and clothing and all the rest of it, and including the myths. So again, a very strong hypothesis we have here is that the myth of Gilgamesh diffused to the Israelites during the time of captivity in Babylon. So, if in myths that are diffused, core elements are retained, like the punishment for wickedness. So in each case, humans were bad and they were being punished, while surface elements change, like the name of the mountain, types of birds, numbers of days and nights. So the one thing I didn't mention was the mountain. In Genesis, it's Mount Ararat. In Gilgamesh, it's Mount Nisir. Both are very important sacred mountains in each one of these cultures. So we have a sacred mountain, but that the identity of the mountain changes. Picture here is a scene from the Epic Gilgamesh from the Babylonian culture. And here, this is a Renaissance painting of Noah's flood. So now I'm going to move on to a second myth. And so let me say this is probably where I'll get to today, the Greek myth of Deucalion, and we'll be continuing next time. All right, so Greece is to the west of the Black Sea, and it appears that there's a myth that is very similar to the ones that we see with the Israelites, with the Hebrews, the forerunners of Judaism, and the Babylonians. But certain elements are different. So I'm going to tell you the myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Here we have a picture of Deucalion and Pyrrha. They're on the left side, throwing, in this case, some salt over their shoulder. This is what happens at the end of the myth. So, but the action starts actually with Zeus. Zeus, the chief of the gods, the great Zeus. Well, he liked to occasionally wander the earth in disguise. And often in these stories, he gets himself into some kind of trouble, but him being Zeus, he can usually get out of it. So in this particular case, Zeus is wandering the earth, and he comes to a castle, the castle of King Lycaon. So Lycaon, and by the way, let me scroll up here, you can find that myth here at this site. But for the moment, I'm just going to give you a little snapshot of the myth. So he goes and he seeks refuge in the castle of King Lycaon, and it is very much the custom in Greece, as it is in a lot of that part of the world. When America started getting involved in Afghanistan, we learned that Afghanis have this custom of welcoming guests and protecting guests, and feeding them and clothing them and housing them. It's very important to treat guests well. So in comes Zeus, and Lycaon tells Zeus that he's going to treat him well, and he lays out a feast, and everything looks good, except for one thing Zeus notices. That there was, and a little bit of a trigger warning here, this is a little gross, but you have that element in myth. There's a human body. Zeus is going to be served human flesh. And that is one of the things put on the table. And in other words, Lycaon, thinking Zeus is a mortal human, is going to, have him become a cannibal. Not a really nice thing to do. This is a major violation, you might say, and that is an understatement, of the guest principle. You don't treat guests like that by serving them human flesh. So Zeus decides that Lycaon is wicked. He's bad, just like the gods of the previous two myths decided humanity is bad. And so in this case, you get two punishments. One specifically for Lycaon. Zeus turns Lycaon into an animal. Now, Lycaon, I don't have his name spelled there. His name is spelled with Lykaon. Sometimes you see it with Lycaon. And that is a root that kind of refers to wolf. And so Zeus turns him into an actual wolf. You might say that he is the original werewolf, the original victim of lycanthropy. So we have that word lycanthropy, means turning somebody into a werewolf. And so you have that element in this particular myth. Okay, so that particular part is a little unlike the myths we had before. This is an example of the Greeks adding on their own elements, with the element retained of a wicked humanity, here expressed by one king. Okay. So, as I said, there's a two-part punishment. Turning King Lycaon into the wolf is not enough for Zeus. He was really angry. So he decides to send, you guessed it, a flood. In this particular case, just like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have multiple gods. In the case of Greece, not only gods, you also have, and everybody say, go Cal State Fullerton, you have Titans. So one of the Titans hears that Zeus is going to send a flood. And it happens to be the Titan Prometheus. Prometheus has a son who's half Titan and half mortal, and his name is Deucalion. And we see him in the picture here. That's Deucalion with his wife Pyrrha. So Prometheus warns Deucalion and Pyrrha, build a boat and survive a flood, which they do. But in this case, there are no animals. He's not instructed to take animals aboard. The flood comes. They wander for, several days and nights. And then they find land on a mountain. So here we have another familiar element, the landing on a mountain. In this case, it's Mount Parnassus, a very sacred mountain to the Greeks. There's one element I did not bring up in the previous myths, and that's what happened after Noah or Utnapishtim landed. There you have a scene in which there is a sacrifice and giving thanks for survival, and then where the gods promise to never do it again. And you essentially have a recreation of humanity. In the case of Noah, we don't really know what happens in the Gilgamesh case, but in Noah, we know that humanity is recreated through incest because that's all that's left. Well, maybe with the possibility of that there might be wives of children, of Noah's children there. But if not, and this has been commented a lot by biblical scholars, humanity is repopulated necessarily through incest, just like at the beginning, when you only had Adam and Eve and their children. So we're all really the children of Noah in that particular instance. The Greeks have a different solution to this. So you see here, and I mentioned that Deucalion and Pyrrha are throwing salt over their shoulders. And you see these figures here on the bottom right. And these are the new humans that are being born from the salt. Men from the salt that Deucalion throws over his shoulder, women from the salt that Pyrrha throws over her shoulder. So instead of sexual reproduction to recreate humanity, you have more of a magical reproduction, thus avoiding the problem of incest. Okay. In the far background, so some of them have grown already, these two, and now they're worshiping the statue here, which looks like it's a goddess. Okay. So that is the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, and that is the Greek myth. So what we have here are three myths: the Hebrews or Israelites, the Sumerians / Babylonians, and the Greeks, and they share elements in common, a punishment for wickedness, eventually leading to a recreation of humanity, but with different elements, different story elements to express them. So now we can ask the question, which will be next time, as to, do we retain these same elements if we go elsewhere? So I'll give you a little preview of what's to come. We're going to look at a Maya flood myth, specifically that comes from the Quiché Maya of Guatemala. And we will look at an Ojibwe flood myth. The Ojibwe live in what is today Minnesota. And their myth involves animal beings, like in a lot of Native American mythology, including this rabbit here named Nanabush. So we're going to look at 2 more myths next time. And then we're going to look at why flood myths. So here we have, and I'm not going to go over them now, we'll go over them next time, some of the ideas of why is it that flood myths are so important and prevalent. If I can get my words out. Okay, so I'm going to pause right now and see if there's any questions. Okay, so I am going to stop the recording. So this is part 1. Stay tuned for part 2.